The ugliest house on Deadwater Reach was the one that made the mill boss laugh out loud. In October of 1881, while every other family along the river was packing mud and moss into their cabin seams, Bastien Leroux was covering his walls in long, rough sheets of cedar bark until the place looked less like a home than something the forest had shed. From the road, it seemed unfinished, wrong, feral. Caleb Harkness, who had spent 24 winters in timber camps and knew exactly what water could do to wood, called it rot with nails in it. He said worms would move in before the snow did. He said one spark would turn the place into a chimney. By spring, 3 of his neighbors had copied him. And the reason was visible from the road. Every roof in the settlement had burned a black ring through the snow around the chimney. Bastien's roof stayed white. That was the mystery. Not just that his family stayed warmer. Not just that his woodpile lasted longer. But that the strangest cabin on the river was holding its heat so well that the snow on top refused to melt. And the answer to that mystery did not begin with a carpenter's manual or a sawmill trick. It began with a peelman, a sick woman who could not leave her bed, and a lesson passed quietly across a frozen bog about how bark handles water when winter turns cruel. Bastien Leroux was not a builder in the way Deadwater Reach respected builders. He did not square timbers. He did not run a pit saw. He had never held a foreman's position in his life. He was a bark peelman. For 11 seasons, first in Quebec and later on the Maine side of the line, he had worked the tannery crews, stripping bark for leather works and sorting sheets by thickness, curl, and season. His tools were a barking iron, a short axe, and a knife polished bright from years of work. His hands could feel the difference between bark cut too early and bark peeled at the right moment. They could feel when a sheet would split, when it would cup, when it would lie flat, and when it would throw water instead of drinking it. His left thumb had a pale seam across the knuckle from an old peel yard accident. When he gripped anything heavy, the thumb locked stiff for a second before settling into place. It made his movements look deliberate, almost patient. People mistook that patience for softness. It was not softness. It was adaptation. 2 years before the winter that changed the Reach, Bastien had brought his wife, Celeste, south from the St. John country to this small logging settlement on an oxbow of the river. With them came Celeste's mother, Agnes Vachon, a woman who had once run a camp kitchen and could carry more split wood than most men cared to admit. Then a freight sled overturned on spring ruts. Agnes survived, but her back did not. By the time the doctor reached them, the verdict was plain. She could be turned in bed. She could be fed, be washed, but she would not stand again. That turned their cabin into more than a house. It turned it into a boundary. Agnes could not be taken downriver to a bigger town. She could not be moved to a warmer room in another home. She could not chase heat. Whatever warmth she had to live on would have to be made inside those 4 walls. Their first winter on Deadwater Reach taught Bastien how little those walls were worth. He had built the cabin the same way everyone else did. Board walls, chinked seams, a hard-work stove in the center room. By local standards, it was a decent structure. Straight enough, tight enough, respectable enough, and utterly defeated by cold. The trouble with a bad winter is that it exposes every lie a house tells in October. By December, the latch bit through mittens. By January, a wash basin left too far from the stove would skin over with ice before dawn. The floor near the outside wall felt like stone. If Celeste set a loaf to cool on the table, the side facing the wall would go stiff first. And in the corner, where Agnes lay, the air had a different character from the rest of the room. Not wind, exactly. Worse than wind. A still, creeping cold that settled into bedding and bone and stayed there. Many mornings, Bastien would wake before light, cross the room, and find a rim of frost where Agnes's breath had dampened the top edge of her blanket. Sometimes, the water pitcher near her bed wore a thin shell of ice. The stove could be glowing red, the center of the room almost pleasant, and yet the far wall still felt as if it belonged to the outdoors. They burned wood at a punishing rate. Birch, maple, whatever he could split and stack before dark. A cord gone in 9 days, then another. Heat rushed upward, outward, away. He was feeding trees into a metal box and getting back one small circle of mercy. Agnes rarely complained. That made it worse. She would simply ask, in the softest possible voice, whether the fire had gone low. Bastian knew what she meant. Not that the flame had dropped, that the room was losing. By the end of that winter, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. If the next cold season hit as hard, Agnes might not live through it. The insight that changed everything came to him from a memory he had nearly treated as a curiosity. The year before, late in trapping season, Bastian had crossed a frozen Kerry trail near a tamarack bog and come upon an older Maliseet hunter repairing the outer skin of a winter shelter. Bastian stopped because bark always caught his eye. The old man, whose name Bastian heard as Thomas Sapag, had paper birch sheets spread on the snow and weighted with stones. He showed Bastian something simple enough to sound obvious once it had been said. Bark has a grain, a lay, a natural direction that wants to send water one way and not another. For summer cover, he said, you could get away with carelessness. Carelessness became a leak. Thomas overlapped the birch so the surface shed moisture over the seams, not into them. He nested the natural curl, instead of fighting it. Water always looks, he told him. For the invitation you leave it. Cold only punishes the invitation later. The line stayed with Bastian, not as folklore, as method, because Bastian already knew another truth from the peel yards. The outer skin of a tree is not junk. It is a system. It handles flow. It dries. It swells and tightens and sheds. And the more he thought about Thomas Sapag's winter shelter, the more he saw something all the respectable cabins on Deadwater Reach were getting wrong. They were trying to defeat winter with one hard boundary. A single wall. A single seal. A single layer expected to stop everything at once. The men of the Reach thought the enemy was draft, so they packed seams with clay, moss, and whatever fibrous matter they had on hand. In early fall, that felt like success. The gusts were muted. The cracks looked closed. But cold weather is not beaten by appearances. The real enemy was moisture moving through a wall and turning against it. Inside a heated cabin, air fills with vapor from lungs, soup kettles, wet wool, laundry, melting snow, and bodies simply existing. That moisture tries to move outward, toward colder, drier air. In a standard cabin, it slips through planks and into the chinked joints. There it meets a surface cold enough to force it into water. Then ice. And ice does not politely sit where it forms. It expands. It powders clay. It splits fibers. It leaves tiny breaks where none existed before. The next wind finds those breaks. The wall that seemed tighter in October becomes weaker in January. Then the stove must work harder. The room dries out in one place and sweats in another. And men congratulate themselves for surviving a battle their own walls are helping the cold win. Bastian did not need a schoolbook to understand this. He had watched frost bloom on Agnes's bedding. He had seen how fast a woodpile collapsed when a house leaked heat from every side. He understood that another sack of chinking would not save them, because the failure was deeper than the seams. The idea of the wall itself was wrong. He was not going to patch the old defense. He was going to wrap the house in a second one. That decision looked insane from the outside almost immediately. In late August, when the ground still held summer, and the camp teams were hauling early cuts, Bastian began collecting paper birch from downed trunks and storm-fallen stems in the low ground. He carried the sheets home carefully, flattening them under stones, so they would keep their width. Then he went after cedar bark in long plates, choosing material thick enough to weather, light enough to hang, and sound enough to keep its shape. The camp laughed before he had finished the first wall. At first they thought he was improvising a temporary windbreak. Then they saw him cover the board wall itself with birch sheets, overlapped deliberately from bottom to top. After that, he nailed on vertical spacers, 4 inches deep, not as framing for a shed or lean-to, but as if he were building an empty chamber around the cabin. An empty chamber. That was the part Caleb Harkness could not tolerate. He reined in one afternoon beside the north wall and stared up at Bastian on a ladder. "What are you making there?" he called. "A place for the weather to sleep." Bastian did not climb down, plain, a place for wet to die. And he kept working. Then came the skin that made everyone certain he had lost his mind. He began hanging the cedar plates over the spacers in overlapping rows. Each one set to throw water down and away. Each course offset so the seams would never make an easy path inward. He paid attention to the natural curve of every piece. If it wanted to cup, he used the cup. If it wanted to spring, he locked it so the spring worked for him, not against him. Day by day, the cabin disappeared under a rough brown hide. The settlement prized clean boards, squared lines, visible labor made respectable by neatness. Bastian's house rejected all of that. It looked older than the camp itself, stranger than a logger's home had any right to look. Wagons slowed to stare. Children called it the fish-scale cabin, Harkness called it tinder rack, bark trap, and worm hotel, depending on the day and the audience. And because he was the mill boss, people believed him. He had reasons. Good ones, at least by the logic he trusted. Bark, he said, would harbor insects. Loose cladding would trap rain. Anything held off the wall by a gap would funnel wind exactly where warmth should stay. He cited a storage shed upriver that had failed after being skinned in waste bark years earlier. He was not a fool inventing objections to protect his pride. He was a competent man applying the wrong model to a problem he did not realize he had misunderstood. Bastian never argued in public. He listened. Sometimes he nodded. Then he went back to his ladder. Because he knew the difference between trapped water and drained water. Between a dead pocket and a drying cavity. Between blocking vapor after it has already entered a wall and stopping it where it begins. What Bastian built around that cabin was not random frontier improvisation. It was a layered system. The outer cedar bark was not the insulation. It was the shield. Its first job was to catch rain, sleet, meltwater, and all the heavy punishment a wall takes from weather. Most of that moisture would never get farther than the outer skin because the bark overlapped the way shingles overlap, using gravity instead of fighting it. But no outer skin is perfect. Driven weather always finds some way past. That is where the 4-inch cavity mattered. To Harkness, the gap was proof of failure. To Bastian, it was the heart of the design. He had not created a pocket to trap wet. He had created a channel where incidental moisture could dry before it ever reached the structural wall. Openings at the bottom and top allowed slow air movement, not a blasting draft, a steady exchange. Enough to carry dampness away, enough to keep the main wall from sitting in contact with water. And that same cavity did something else the Reach barely understood. It held a deep layer of relatively still air. Not perfectly sealed, not wild and wind-torn, just deep enough and protected enough to resist quick heat transfer. The outer bark broke weather. The airspace slowed loss. The inner birch controlled vapor trying to escape from the warm room. Together, they turned a thin cabin wall into a managed system instead of a single exhausted barrier. The paper birch laid against the boards was the quiet genius in the whole assembly. It stopped interior moisture from driving outward into freezing surfaces. Warm vapor hit that inner skin and was forced to stay on the warm side of the wall, where it belonged. No hidden frost layer. No soaked chinking. No slow internal rot beginning where nobody could see it. Bastian had not made the wall thicker in the usual sense, he had made it smarter. By the time the first dry snow came in November, the cabin looked wilder than ever and the jokes were at their loudest. But inside, changes arrived in details. The corner near Agnes's bed no longer felt abandoned by the stove. The floor close to the wall lost its knife-edge chill. Celeste could sew at the table without shifting her chair every few minutes to stay comfortable. Wet mittens hung near the door and actually dried instead of freezing into shape. The stove was still necessary, of course. This was Maine, not paradise. But its labor had changed. It no longer roared against a losing wall, it held a room that finally wanted to stay warm. Agnes noticed it before anyone said so. One morning she touched the blanket near her feet and smiled. "Dry," she said, almost a whisper, almost with surprise. That single word told Bastian more than any theory could have. Still, quiet comfort is not the kind of proof that changes a settlement. People can dismiss comfort. They can call it imagination, preference, or luck. What they cannot dismiss is a week of murderous cold. The test came after Christmas. First there was a thaw sharp enough to send water running off packed roofs. Then sleet hardened everything it touched. Fence rails, branch tips, harness leather, door latches. The whole reach woke under a glaze. That night, the temperature dropped like a hammer and kept dropping. By the second day, the river edges had locked up in thick white shelves. By the third, the team's breath froze on their chest straps. By the fourth, men were waking to nails that snapped if bent outdoors too quickly. For 10 straight days, the temperature scarcely rose. 5 of those nights plunged far below zero. It was the kind of cold that quiets a camp, because every unnecessary movement feels like waste. Woodpiles shrank at a terrifying pace. Men who prided themselves on preparation were out with axes before dawn, splitting extra fuel in air that hurt their teeth. Families crowded closer to stoves, and closed off corners of their homes, as if surrendering territory to an invading army. The settlement did what winter settlements do when weather turns personal. It narrowed, endured, and counted. Inside Bastian's cabin, the cold was still real, but it was not in command. The stove burned lower than anyone outside would have believed. Not dead low. Sensible low. A steady bed of heat instead of a desperate one. The room held in the high 50s, sometimes better when cooking was underway. Agnes's pitcher stayed liquid. Celeste strung damp laundry and found it soft by morning. Bastian tracked the woodpile with the obsession of a man who had suffered before. And for the first time, he saw days passing without panic. His wall was not making heat. It was refusing to squander it. Then came the image that broke Caleb Harkness. On the 6th morning of the deep freeze, he was driving down the river road to inspect a jam-prone intake box near the sorting boom. The sky was flat and pale. Sound carried strangely in the cold. Every homestead he passed told the same story from above. Snow melted thin around the chimney, then gone altogether in dark, wet halos. Some roofs showed a little loss. Others looked almost bare in a wide ring, as though the house were bleeding warmth straight through its boards. Harkness had seen that all his life. It was normal, expected, the visible tax every family paid to stay alive. Then he looked toward Bastian Leroux's place, and stopped the sled. The horses stamped once, then stood. Harkness leaned forward, not because distance was the problem, but because his mind needed a second arrangement of the facts. Bastian's roof was white from ridge to eave. Not mostly white, not patched, white. Snow lay over it in an even, undisturbed layer, except where the stovepipe pierced through. There was smoke, yes. A thin gray strand rising cleanly into the bitter air. But there was almost no melt around it. No black ring. No wet collapse. No visible waste. The cabin was being heated. The roof insisted otherwise. That contradiction sat in front of Harkness like a challenge to everything he trusted about wood, weather, and common sense. He could have dismissed rumors. He could have dismissed comfort. He could not dismiss snow. Snow was measurement. Snow was evidence. If Bastian's family had fire in that cabin, and the roof was still holding its white cover in that kind of cold, then the heat was staying where other houses could not keep it. Which meant the ugly, barkskin wall Harkness had mocked was doing something his own cleaner, better-regarded construction was not. He stared long enough for the horse's breath to plume around him like steam from a stopped engine. And in that long stare the authority of the most respected timberman on Deadwater Reach began to crack. He did not ride over and apologize. Men like Harkness rarely reverse in one dramatic flourish. They retreat by measurement first. By afternoon he had described what he saw to the river scaler, a man whose business was dimensions, yield, and fact. Harkness spoke carefully. Snow cover. Outside temperature. Visible smoke. No melt ring. The scaler understood the implication at once. If the observation was true, the wall was not a curiosity. It was performance. After that, mockery lost its footing. People began stopping at Bastian's place not to laugh, but to inspect. They touched the cedar skin. They crouched to look at the lower openings. They asked where the inner bark began, how wide the cavity ran, whether the outer skin sat directly on the boards, whether insects had appeared, whether wind got inside the gap, whether the whole thing rattled in storms. Bastian answered every question plainly. He showed them the spacers. He explained the drying path. He described the birch membrane. He repeated, as best he could, the lesson he had learned out on the frozen trail. Water must be taught where to go before cold teaches it where to destroy. By late winter, the first imitations appeared. Not whole cabin rebuilds. North walls first, then the most exposed faces. Men used what they had. Cedar, spruce slabs, bark sheets from camp waste, and discovered that even a partial second skin could change how long a room held warmth after the stove settled. A small newspaper in Skowhegan eventually mentioned the method in a brief column about unusual winter-saving practices in the logging districts. It did not turn Bastian into a celebrity. It did something more useful. It made the idea legible. What he had built would later be given language that sounded far too modern for the rough river bend where it was born. A ventilated rain screen with an interior vapor control layer. But the principle was older than the term. Keep bulk water out. Give stray moisture a way to dry. Stop interior vapor before it freezes where it should not. Protect the heat by managing air instead of merely stuffing cracks. That is the secret modern high-performance walls still obey. And Deadwater Reach learned it because one peelman was willing to look foolish in public for the sake of a woman who could not get up and warm herself. That matters. Because it would be easy to tell this story as a frontier oddity. An ugly cabin. A stubborn man. A humiliated expert. And yes, all of that is there. The reversal is satisfying for a reason. Authority is compelling when it is right, but unforgettable when visible proof makes it kneel. Yet the real force beneath the story is quieter. Agnes Vashon could not walk to the stove. She could not fetch another blanket. She could not move herself to the warm side of the room when the wall beside her turned cruel. So Bastian changed the wall. He did not build for admiration. He did not build for novelty. He built because care, when it is serious enough, becomes engineering. That is why the strangest cabin on the river became the one people studied. And that is why the snow on its roof mattered so much. It was not just snow. It was proof that warmth had finally reached the person in the room who needed it most.